years, people forgot about the tomb, and soon nobody remembered Tutankhamun's name. Then, in 1922, an Englishman opened Tutankhamun's tomb and found many wonderful things. Everyone wanted to see them, and suddenly the boy king was famous. But we do not know a lot about him. Was he a good pharaoh? Was he happy? Did he have many friends? Perhaps in a different tomb there are some papyri with stories about Tutankhamun. Perhaps a friend lived with Tutankhamun in the king's palace and knew him well. Perhaps the friend was a boy, and perhaps his name was Aziru. Chapter 2. Aziru's story begins. My name is Aziru, and I come from Amuru, a country to the northeast of Egypt. My father was king of Amuru. One day, when I was young, my father called me to him.
Aziru,
he said,
who are the Hittites?
People from the north, I answered. They don't like us or our friends, the Egyptians. My father looked at me.
That's true,
he said quietly.
but they are coming to Amuru. Because we are a small country, we can't stop them.
I wanted to ask questions, but my father put up his hand.
You must leave Amuru,
he said.
You must go to Egypt and stay there. I know Pharaoh Akhenaten, and you can live with him in the city of Amarna.
Egypt? I could not speak. I did not know much about Egypt. Amuru was my home, and I did not want to leave my family and friends. I was afraid. But my father was the king, and I always listened to him.
A boat is waiting for you,
said my father.
You must go quickly.
Yes, father, I said. So I left Amuru and went to Egypt. I was 7 years old, and I never saw my father again. I went by sea and by river, and after many, many days, I arrived in Amarna. The city was very different from my home. My city was small, but in Amarna there were hundreds of houses, and the streets were alive with thousands of people. When I arrived at the palace in Amarna, soldiers took me to Pharaoh Akhenaten. The palace was beautiful and much bigger than my father's. I met Pharaoh Akhenaten, and he said,
Aziru, you're like one of my sons now. Be happy here.
I thanked him. Then I met Akhenaten's oldest son, Smenkhkare, and Akhenaten's youngest son, Tutankhaten. I smiled at Tutankhaten, but he looked away and said nothing. So I began living in Akhenaten's beautiful palace. Slowly, I learned to speak like an Egyptian, dress like an Egyptian, and eat like an Egyptian. I liked Egypt, but I did not have any friends. When I went to the palace gardens or to the river, nobody came with me. Tutankhaten did not speak to me. Why? Perhaps he did not like me because I was not Egyptian. I did not know. Chapter 3. A Talking Bird. A year after I arrived in Egypt, Pharaoh Akhenaten died, and after 70 days, the priests took his body to his tomb. Usually, Pharaoh's tombs were in the Valley of the Kings, or near Giza, in the north of Egypt, but not Akhenaten's. His tomb was near Amarna. Now Smenkhkare was the new Pharaoh, the king of all Egypt. Out in the streets, the people of Amarna sang and played music. The Egyptians always sang when there was a new Pharaoh, and this time I sang with them too. These were happy days, but I was not always happy in the palace. Smenkhkare was friendly to me, but Tutankhaten never spoke to me. And then there was Horemheb. Horemheb was the most important and powerful soldier in Egypt, and he did not like me. He was always angry, and I was afraid of him. When Horemheb was in the palace, I often went to the palace gardens. I loved the gardens. There were lots of beautiful trees, animals, and birds. I liked the green parakeets the most. One of the parakeets always came and ate from my hand, and I called him Nefer. He could say one or two things, and I taught him some more. I talked to him a lot. I told him everything, and very often I told him about Horemheb. One afternoon, I was in the garden with Nefer when somebody spoke behind me. "What are you doing with that bird?" I looked up and saw Tutankhaten's face. "Answer me," he said. "I'm waiting," I said. "My parakeet usually talks to me, but today he's very quiet." Tutankhaten laughed. "Birds can't talk," he said. "This one can." Tutankhaten had a bad leg, so he did not like to stand. He called for his chair and sat down. The chair had gold on it, and its feet were like a lion's feet. Tutankhaten always asked for this chair because it was his father's old one, and Tutankhaten loved it. He sat back in it now and looked at Nefer. "Speak, bird," he said. We looked at Nefer and waited, but Nefer sat on my hand and said nothing. After a minute or two, Tutankhaten laughed and stood up. "I knew it! No bird can talk!" Just then, Horemheb came into the garden. He walked across and stood next to us.
"Where's the Pharaoh?"
he asked angrily. "I don't know," answered Tutankhaten.
"I must find him,"
said Horemheb, and he began to walk away, when...
"Horemheb is angry!"
Horemheb looked at us, mouth open.
"Who said that?"
he asked. We did not answer.
"Horemheb is angry! Horemheb is angry!"
Nefer called. Horemheb's face went dark, and he looked at the little green bird. Then he looked at me. I began to say sorry, but he walked away. When Horemheb was out of the gardens, Tutankhaten looked at me, and I smiled at him. Then we laughed. We could not stop laughing. And after that, I ate with Tutankhaten, laughed with him, and played with him. Tutankhaten and I were now friends. Chapter 4. The New Pharaoh. When Tutankhaten was 9 years old, his brother, the Pharaoh Smenkhkare, died. Now, Tutankhaten wore the crown of Egypt. On the crown, there was a snake and the head of a big bird, the vulture. The snake was called the uraeus, and it was important because only pharaohs wore the uraeus. Egyptian pharaohs carried 2 sticks too. These were called the crook and flail. The crook was the smallest of the 2 sticks, and when the people saw it, they remembered this. Their pharaoh loved them very much. The flail was long, and when the people saw it, they remembered a different thing. Their pharaoh was a good and powerful king. Because my friend was a very young pharaoh, many people helped him. Some of these people were powerful priests, but Tutankhaten listened most to Horemheb, the soldier, and to I, his vizier. All pharaohs had a vizier. The vizier was a very important man in the palace, and he helped the pharaoh very much. I was from Tutankhaten's family. He was much older and much smaller than Horemheb, and he always spoke slowly and carefully. He smiled a lot, but his eyes were small and quick. Sometimes I thought, are I and Horemheb true friends of Tutankhaten, or do they want to be pharaoh? The first years of Tutankhaten's time as pharaoh were not easy. There was a plague in Egypt, so many people were ill, and many more died. "Help us, Pharaoh," they said. "Stop the plague." But Tutankhaten could not. The plague killed, and the people were angrier and angrier. "Why are they angry with you?" I asked my friend, Tutankhaten. "Before my father was pharaoh, Egypt had lots of gods. Amun, Isis, Anubis, and many more," he told me. "But my father didn't like these gods. He said to the people, 'Forget these old gods. We are going to have only one God, Aten, the sun god.' But now the people are saying, 'Aten is not powerful. Aten cannot stop the plague. Only our old god, Amun, can. He is the king of the gods. We must leave Amarna and go to Thebes. Thebes is Amun's city. He can help us there. So, are we going to move to Thebes? I asked Tutankhaten. I don't know, he said. I and Horemheb want to go, but the priests of Aten don't, and I must listen to them too. We stayed in Amarna, but Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun. He did this because he wanted to please his people and Amun, but it did not help. More and more people died of the plague, and Egypt got angrier and angrier. 2 years went by. Often now, in the palace at Amarna, we could hear angry men in faraway rooms. It was Horemheb and I, and they were with Aten's priests. I did not understand much. I was only 11 years old. I was afraid, but Tutankhamun was not. He was never afraid. After a time, things changed again. Now I and Horemheb look happy, and Aten's priests look angry, I said to Tutankhamun one evening. What's happening? There was some papyrus on the table in front of me, and I began making a picture. We're leaving Amarna, said Tutankhamun, and he sat down slowly. We're moving to Thebes. Can I come with you? I asked. I don't want to go home to Amuru. Yes, of course. I can't leave my best friend. I smiled and finished my picture of 2 boys. When Tutankhamun saw it, he laughed. You're the pharaoh in this picture, he said. You have the crook and flail in your hands, and the crown on your head. I know, I answered. Now Horemheb can't be angry with me, because I'm Pharaoh Aziru. Tutankhamun's leg hurt more every day, and he was only 11 years old. But now he stood up and spoke like a man. The old gods are important, and perhaps they're angry with us. But I'm going to make new temples for them, all across Egypt. We need to please the old gods, and the new temples can do that. Then the old gods can help Egypt, and Egypt can be rich again. I want to see Thebes, I said. I want to go on the Nile and... The door opened, and Horemheb walked into the room with I. Horemheb looked at me, and I looked away. Horemheb and I are never going to be friends, I thought. He always remembered that day with Nefer, my green parakeet. Everything is ready, my pharaoh, said I quietly, and he smiled. We can leave tomorrow. Good, said Tutankhamun. Horemheb said nothing, but his eyes stayed on me. Come, my pharaoh, said I. You must sleep. We have a long day tomorrow,
and we must leave early.
Tutankhamun smiled. A long day, perhaps, but more importantly, a great day. And it was true. After Tutankhamun left Amarna, he made many new temples for the old gods. The old gods were happy, and the Egyptian people were happy too. Chapter 5. A Lesson with Senedjem. Every year, there was more and more gold in Egypt's new temples. Egypt was rich again, and the people loved their pharaoh. He gave them their old gods, gods like Amun, Isis, and Anubis, and the old gods smiled on Egypt. Tutankhamun had a wife now, called Ankhisanamun. But he was only 13 years old, and 13-year-old boys in palaces had teachers. Tutankhamun was like a brother to me, so when he had lessons, I had lessons too. Our teacher was called Senedjem, and we worked with him every day. I did not like listening to Senedjem, and I did not like learning hieroglyphics, or hearing about the gods, or the stars. But Tutankhamun did. One morning, I went to the Nile for a walk. Tutankhamun liked the river, but he did not often come with me now, because his leg hurt more and more. At the river, I walked slowly for some time, and looked at the water and at the hills, red in the early morning sun. Then I heard a noise and looked down. At my feet, I saw a little brown frog. I liked frogs, so I put it in my pocket. Then I ran to the palace. I was late. I thought about Senedjem's angry face and ran fast. In the schoolroom, I sat next to Tutankhamun, and Senedjem began talking about Sothis. Sothis was an important star for the Egyptians. When Egyptians saw this star in the night sky, they were happy. They said, "Soon the Nile is going to bring lots of water onto the fields. It's going to flood." The flood was very important in Egypt. Egyptians could grow many things when the waters of the Nile came onto the fields in the summer months. Senedjem talked and talked, and of course, my eyes slowly began to close. "Where does the water for the flood come from?" asked Tutankhamun. "It comes from the gods. When the god Isis cries, this brings the water," answered Senedjem. "Does the Nile flood every year?" asked Tutankhamun. "No, sometimes there is no flood, and—" "Aziru!" cried Senedjem. "Open your eyes!" "Yes, teacher," I said. "Please write Sothis," said Senedjem. At that time, I was not good at hieroglyphics. I looked at Tutankhamun, and he smiled
and put his head down. "Did you hear me, Aziru?" said Sennajem. "Write Sothis in hieroglyphics. Now!" I... Tutankhamun laughed. "I can't," I said. "I see," said Sennajem. "And why not?" "Because I don't have a reed," I said. "In Egypt, we took reeds from the river and made them into pens with a knife." Sennajem looked at me angrily, then walked to his big table. He had his back to me, and suddenly the frog in my pocket moved. I saw Sennajem's cup of water on the table in front of me, and my hand went into my pocket. Sennajem came back with a reed. "Now write Sothis," he said. "Yes, teacher." Sennajem watched me and took a big drink from his cup. "What?" he cried. The cup fell from his hand and water went all over the room. "Who put a frog in my drink?" Just then, Horemheb and I came in. "What's the matter?" asked I. "There was a frog in my drink!" cried Sennajem. "That boy!" Horemheb looked angrily at me. He opened his mouth, but I put a hand on his arm. "Horemheb, he's the Pharaoh's friend, and he's young. Once you were young too." I looked at us and smiled. He was often friendly like this and helped us. But when I looked at him, I thought of a snake. Why did I think of a snake? Was it his small eyes? Was it his body? Was it his teeth? I did not know. Was he a good man? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Chapter 6. The Festival of Opet. Every year in Egypt, there was an important festival called Opet. Opet was a festival for the god Amun, and it was important for the Egyptians because they wanted Amun to be happy. When he was happy, they thought, he could help them. Amun's statue was in Karnak, a temple to the north of Thebes. For the festival, the Egyptian priests put the statue of Amun in a boat at Karnak, and then took it to the temple at Luxor with the pharaoh. Statues of Amun's wife, Mut, and his son, Kunz, came to Luxor in boats too, and then more than 30 priests carried the statues into the temple. The people could watch from the river, but only Tutankhamun and some of the priests could go into the temple. The statues stayed in the temple for about 24 days. Then, when Amun's statue came out and went back to Karnak, the festival stopped. One year, when we were about 16 years old, I went with Tutankhamun to Karnak. We arrived there late at night, and early the next morning,
when Tutankhamun was in the temple, I went to the river. His boat was there. It was beautiful. It was about 30 meters long, and it had lots of gold on it. I thought about my friend and felt sorry for him. His leg is hurting more and more, I thought, and today is going to be a long day, because he is taking the statue of Amun from Karnak to Luxor Temple. Then I thought of something. I looked for some nice, long reeds and took my knife from my pocket. I wanted to make something for my friend, but I needed to be quick. I don't have much time, I thought. When Tutankhamun comes out of the temple, it must be ready. An hour or two later, I heard a noise and looked up. There they were, Tutankhamun and all the priests, with the statue of the god Amun. They came out of the temple and down to the river. I stood up and ran to Tutankhamun with the thing in my hand. "What is it?" Tutankhamun asked. "A walking stick. I made it for you." Tutankhamun took the walking stick and looked at it happily. "How did you make it?" he asked me. "With reeds," I said. I heard chariots then, and Horemheb arrived. There were many soldiers in chariots behind him. "Look," said Tutankhamun to Horemheb. "Aziru made this for me." Horemheb looked down at me. "You made it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. Horemheb smiled. "Good boy," he said. Good boy! I wanted to laugh. After that, everybody got on boats, and soon they were ready. I could not go on Tutankhamun's gold boat. I was not the pharaoh, so I went on a smaller boat behind. Slowly at first, but then more quickly, all the boats moved away from Karnak. Then I saw Tutankhamun. He stood up and called to me, and he had the new walking stick in his hand. "Good boy!" he cried, and he looked down at me like Horemheb. I laughed for a long time after that. Chapter 7. The Call of the Jackal. Tutankhamun was always tired after the festival of Opet. So when the festival finished, he often went to his palace in Memphis, in the north of Egypt. From Memphis, Tutankhamun could easily visit Giza. There were 3 big pyramids at Giza: the Pyramid of Khafra, the Pyramid of Khufu, and the Pyramid of Menkaure. Menkaure was the smallest of these, but it was taller than the tallest temple in Egypt. Many years before, when pharaohs died, the Egyptians put their bodies into pyramids. But now, pharaohs had their tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The pyramids were interesting, and Tutankhamun liked to see them. But he liked to go out and look for animals in the hills there more. One year, when we were about 18, We left Memphis for Giza later than usual. It was afternoon when we came down to the river, and Tutankhamun's boat was ready. Near the boat, there were many soldiers in chariots. Tutankhamun got into his boat, and we suddenly heard a cry. "Don't go!" called I. "Wait! Please, wait!" We looked up and saw I with Ankhisanamun, Tutankhamun's wife. Because I was an old man, he could not walk quickly, so we waited. "What is I's man carrying?" asked Tutankhamun. "I don't know," I said. "Let's wait and see." "What's the matter?" Tutankhamun asked when I arrived at the boat. "This is for you," said I, and he gave Tutankhamun a shield. There was a picture of Tutankhamun and lions on it. "My workers finished it minutes ago." "Thank you, I," said Tutankhamun. And he looked carefully at the shield. "It's beautiful." I smiled again, and his small eyes moved quickly. "Good luck in Giza, my pharaoh," he said. "Please be careful." "I always am," said Tutankhamun. "That's not true," his wife laughed. Tutankhamun smiled, and the boat began to move away down the river. We arrived in Giza 2 hours later, and it was night when we went out into the hills. There were soldiers with us, but Tutankhamun was the pharaoh, so he was in front. We walked slowly and stopped. We listened. There was no noise. Nothing moved. We began walking again, and suddenly I saw something at my feet. Footprints. I looked at them carefully. I did not want to be wrong. And I was not. "Over here," I called quietly. Horemheb ran quickly to me, and Tutankhamun came behind with his walking stick. "What is it?" asked Horemheb, but then he saw the footprints too. He looked at them carefully. Then, after a minute, he spoke. "Yes," he said. "These are a lion's." "But the lion can't walk well, I think," said Tutankhamun. "These footprints don't look right." "We're close to it," said Horemheb. "When we find it, you can kill it." Then we heard a great roar, the noise of the lion not far from us. "Come," said Horemheb. "Quickly." We went up the hill, and then we saw it, a beautiful orange-gold lion. For a second, it did not see Tutankhamun or our men. Then suddenly, its eyes were on us. "Kill it, Pharaoh!" cried Horemheb. "Now!" But Tutankhamun did not. "Look at its leg," he said. "It has a bad leg. I cannot kill it." There were more soldiers near us now, and Tutankhamun called to them. "Don't kill it," he said. The soldiers stopped. The lion looked at the soldiers. Then it opened its mouth and gave a great roar.
When it was quiet again, it looked at Tutankhamun. Then, slowly, it walked away into the night. When we arrived back at the palace in Memphis that night, we were not tired, and Tutankhamun wanted to play Senet, an Egyptian game. Tutankhamun was a good player, and I was too. It was a warm night, and we played for 2 hours or more. In our last game, Tutankhamun went on to the House of Water. I needed a 3, and I got it, and finished the game. I was happy. Tutankhamun smiled, took his walking stick, and stood up. But then, something happened. "What was that?" he asked. "What?" I said. "I heard a jackal," said Tutankhamun. And he looked at the dark hills. "Listen! There it is again." But I could not hear a jackal. I looked at Tutankhamun, and he looked at me. We said nothing more, but I felt afraid. The god, Anubis, one of the gods of the dead, was a jackal. Why did Tutankhamun hear it when I did not? We said good night and went to our rooms. But that night I had a bad dream. My dream began in a temple in Thebes. There, priests carried a dead ostrich to a table and put flowers on it. After that, Ankhesenamun came into the temple. When she saw the dead bird, she cried. She could not stop. Then my dream changed. I was on a boat. The boat went from east to west across the Nile to the Valley of the Kings. The ostrich was in the boat, but now it was gold. I could hear a name, and the name was Tutankhamun. Chapter 8. The Ostrich Fan. Early the next morning, when I opened my eyes, I thought about my dream and the game of Senet the night before. I felt very tired, and I wanted to sleep. But I heard the noise of soldiers and chariots, and then Tutankhamun came into my room. "Aziru," he said, "how are you?" "I'm alive," I said. Tutankhamun laughed. "I can see that." I smiled up at Tutankhamun. He looked different today. "Are you going out in your chariot?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Horemheb and I are going north." "North? But why?" I began to ask, but stopped. One of Tutankhamun's men was there in the room with us. I sat up and looked at the man. He moved a fan slowly up and down over Tutankhamun's head. Everybody needed fans on hot days. But on this fan, there was a picture. "No!" I cried. "What's the matter?" asked Tutankhamun. "There's a gold ostrich on the fan," I said. "Yes, there is. But I don't understand. What's wrong with that?" said Tutankhamun. "I saw it in my dream last night. Something bad is going to happen. Don't go out in your chariot today. Stay in the palace. Please listen to me." "But I can't stay. My men are working on one of Amun's temples, and I need to go and look at it. You wait here and sleep." "No," I said again. But Tutankhamun walked to the door. "Wait!" I called, but he did not stop. He walked away. The man with the fan left too, and the room went quiet. Later that day, Tutankhamun's men brought him back to the palace. "What happened?" I asked when I saw him. "It was an accident," said Horemheb. "He was in his chariot, and then it hit something. He broke his leg." Was it really an accident, I thought? Many people wanted to be the new pharaoh. Did one of them hurt him? Some soldiers took Tutankhamun to his room, and Ankhesenamun stayed with him all night. The next morning, he was a little better. But then, the fever came. I brought a doctor. "The best doctor in Egypt," he said. But Tutankhamun's fever did not stop. Soon, Tutankhamun was very ill. He stopped talking, and he did not know me, Ankhesenamun, Horemheb, or I. Not long after, Tutankhamun, my friend, died. Many people in Egypt thought someone killed Tutankhamun for his crown. My best friend was dead, and for many days I did not leave the palace. I did not want to see people. I wanted to cry for Tutankhamun, the boy king. The priests took his body to the temple at Thebes. Then, after more than 70 days, they took him to the Valley of the Kings. His tomb was not ready, so they put him in a smaller one. After that, the priests read from the Book of the Dead and opened his mouth. They did this because
Tutankhamun needed to eat and drink in the afterlife. Later, the priests brought many things: his chair, his crook and flail, his crown, his walking sticks, his shield, his senate game, and the fan. He needed these in the afterlife, too. Then they closed the door of the tomb. And there, Anubis, the god of the dead, came to meet him. There was more good than bad in Tutankhamun, Anubis said, so he could go and live in the afterlife, and be happy there for all time. But in Egypt, some people were more interested in the pharaoh's crown. "I am from the pharaoh's family," A said. "Listen to the gods. A is the next pharaoh," they say. The priests liked A, so soon he wore the pharaoh's crown. But not for long. After 3 years, he died, and Horemheb was the next Egyptian pharaoh. In the end, I left the palace, but I did not go back to Amurru. My father was dead, and the Hittites were there. I stayed in Egypt and found a wife, a beautiful Egyptian woman. I was happy and rich. But I never forgot my friend, Pharaoh Tutankhamun. I am an old man now, and I have white hair and a walking stick, too. I love living in Egypt with my family, but I want to see my friend again. Perhaps he is waiting in the afterlife for me."
Chapter 9. Inside Tutankhamun's tomb. 3,000 years after Tutankhamun died, Howard Carter, an Englishman, came to the Valley of the Kings. Carter knew about Tutankhamun, and he wanted to find his tomb. His friend, Lord Carnarvon, wanted to find it too. Lord Carnarvon gave Carter some money and went back to England, and Carter began looking. But for the next 5 years he found nothing. In 1922, Lord Carnarvon spoke to Carter. "You must stop working," he said. "There is no lost tomb in the Valley of the Kings. I cannot give you more money." "No," said Carter. "We can't stop now. Let's look for 1 more year, please." "All right," said Lord Carnarvon, "but only for 1 more year." Carter went back to the Valley of the Kings. He worked and worked, but he found nothing. Then, on the 4th of November, 1922, his men saw a door under the tomb of Pharaoh Ramesses VI. There was a name on the door, and the name was Tutankhamun. Lord Carnarvon came to Egypt at once, and he and Carter opened the door. There was nothing behind that door, but they found a second door, and Carter looked through it. "What can you see?" asked Lord Carnarvon. For a minute, Carter could not speak. Then he said, "Wonderful things!" There was a room behind the door, and in the room were gold chairs, tables, chariots, and 2 big statues of Tutankhamun. When the men broke down the door and went into the room, they found a 3rd door next to the statues. In the room behind that door, they saw a beautiful coffin in a big box. In the coffin, there was a 2nd coffin, and then a 3rd gold one. When Carter opened the 3rd coffin, he found Tutankhamun's body. There was a mask on his head, and it was blue and gold, and had a vulture and a snake on it. When people heard about the tomb, they wanted to see Tutankhamun's beautiful things. Suddenly, everybody knew the name of the boy king. Carter and his men worked for years in the tomb. They wrote about it and took photos, and then, very carefully, took everything to Egypt's biggest city, Cairo. Many of the things are there today, and every year more than 1 million people go and look at them. They see Tutankhamun's beautiful old chair, and the pharaoh's crook and flail and crown. They see his walking stick, his Senate game, and a shield with pictures of lions. And they see a fan, too, a fan with an ostrich on it.